Good morning, everybody. I get a kick out of this chart, which accurately depicts our seasons here in Ohio. Right now, we are either in full spring or perhaps the spring of deception. Really lovely weather, but I know that probably another snowstorm or two still awaits us. Either way, I am taking advantage of this nice weather to do all of my garden prep work. So ensuring that all of the non-planting related tasks are done so that when actual spring decides to show up, all I have to do is plant. In today's video, I'll be sharing exactly what I'm doing to prep the garden for spring planting. So let's jump in. First up on the task list is to add and repair garden infrastructure. Now, there are a few decisions that I've made in my garden layout and design that, as I've had time to live with them, have found they're just not working for me. Now is a great time to fix those mistakes so that come full swing planting time, my garden is working exactly the way that I want it to. It's easy to move through, to maneuver through. I have access to everything I want, and I just feel comfortable in the space. So the first of those design type mistakes that I made was having a big tiered planter here in the middle of these beds. Now, this is a main walkway, and that planter took up quite a bit of room. It was hard to maneuver a wheelbarrow around. It just kind of got in the way. And I committed the cardinal gardening sin of planting mint in that planter. Now, as we all know, mint is incredibly aggressive and will spread everywhere. It's best planted in a contained pot. I thought maybe the planter would help keep it contained a little, but of course it started spreading into my walkways and was eventually going to get into my beds, which I did not want. So I dug up all that mint, moved the planter out of here. I will probably move it somewhere else, more in a corner of the garden, use it for something like strawberries, because they do really well in a tiered system like that. And I opened up this whole area. So now I've got this nice big open space, and what I decided to do was put another of my cattle panel arches here. I've talked about these before in other videos, but I really love these. This not only frees up space in my walkways, but it adds vertical growing space. So it's perfect for any vining crops, but I especially like them for squash and gourds, cucumbers, pole and runner beans, and vining flowers. I love these cattle panel trellises also because they're relatively cheap, they're easy to put up, and they're super durable. Now, assembly is much easier with two people, as you can see from my not very elegant efforts here, but it's totally doable with one. And putting this archway up took me only about half an hour by myself. Now, I simply zip tie the cattle panel in place till I get a chance to come back in with some wire to permanently secure these. Something else here that's been on my to-do list for a while, I want to pretty up these posts just a bit by hitting these white tops with a coat of spray paint. This will allow them to blend into the landscape a little better instead of being such an eyesore. Now, this color turned out a bit more John Deere green than I expected it to, but I still think it looks nicer than the white, and I can always come back through and hit them with one more coat of a darker green. I've got the front half of the garden done, and eventually I'll circle around the back and do the entire perimeter. Now, another design flaw that I noticed was that I added and fenced in this section of the garden early last year. And while I really liked this addition, I found that I was never going into this area and doing any kind of maintenance. That was because when I originally created this whole section was covered with fence. So in order to access this part of the garden, I had to go clear out of the main garden, walk around, and come in through this arched entrance. Now, when I originally made the decision to do this, I thought, this won't be a big deal. That's not that much trouble to walk out and enter it through that other entrance. But in reality, again, after living with this scenario, it became very obvious that this was indeed a design flaw. This was a super easy fix. I use this welded wire fencing all around the garden. It's very easy to cut with wire snips. So all I had to do was cut out a section of the fence, wrap those loose ends around this post, and I have a nice big access way into this portion of the garden. I can tell you already, just from living with this for a couple of weeks, it is such an improvement. And not to harp on this point, but I really do think Evaluating your garden for accessibility and ease of movement into all spaces of the garden is one of the best things that we can do as gardeners. You can spend a ton of time designing your whole layout on paper, on computer apps, and get it to a point where it feels really, really nice. But there are some things that you just really don't find out until you've lived in the space for a while. And if something does not feel right, don't be afraid to change it. It often feels like more work up front, but in the long run, it is more than worth it. I feel like a great garden design is one that can change and adapt along with the needs of the gardener. So don't be afraid to shake things up a little bit. Now, next up, I'll share another example of this in my own garden. But first, I wanted to take just a moment to thank the sponsor of today's video, Hisea. One of my garden must-haves is a dependable pair of work boots. And this time of year, what we like to refer to as mud season here in Ohio, I need something waterproof, comfortable, easy to clean, and breathable. Something I can wear all day long while working in the garden. Hisea's rubber garden boots fit that bill to a T. They are 100% waterproof, super easy to just spray off with a garden hose after sloshing around in all that muck. But they have a breathable mesh lining that wicks moisture and sweat, so my feet don't end up feeling all nasty after a long day of work. They're easy to slip on and off, flexible, and extremely comfortable. And this pair features this snazzy roll-down design. I can wear them up or down depending on temperature, the level of outdoor muddiness, or if I'm just feeling especially flowery on a particular day. Best of all, Hisea offers a 100-year lifetime warranty and a 100% warm and dry guarantee. Now, if you find yourself in need of some great dependable gardening boots, head over to Hisea.com and check out their wide selection. And be sure to use my code Jenna15 for 15% off any Hisea product. Now, back to the gardening. So here's another great example of a design feature that just was not working. I put this trellis up a couple of seasons ago, and while I love the trellis itself, my choice in layout was not a good one. I positioned it up against this raised bed, and my path gets really narrow right here, and this is just not functioning optimally. I'm thinking that I'm going to take this whole thing out, swing it around to face the other direction, and position it so that it's spanning these two beds. That way, again, I've opened up access to my full walkway, and it should be really easy to plant this thing because it's anchored in two already existing garden beds. Now, do I really want to pull this all out of here and redo it? No, I do not. But will this make the garden more enjoyable in the long run? Absolutely. And there are a few other areas of the garden that need repair. I've been putting these off as well, but I'm going to have to tackle them very soon. My garden door here needs replaced. These raised beds will need fixed. And my grape arbor will need repaired. My goal is to have these repairs done before my last frost date in May. Another big task this time of year is that I am tackling the maintenance of all my walkways and paths before I get into the full swing of planting. Getting a fresh layer of mulch down in all of my walkways before we get into the really wet, yucky, rainy season ensures that I'm not out here just slopping through mud. It also majorly helps suppress weeds. For many of my paths, I'm simply laying down new cardboard and topping that with a thick layer of wood mulch. I got a couple of loads of wood chips from Chip Drop last month, and it's a mix of some delightful smelling evergreens. I think there's some red cedar in here, maybe some pine, I'm not sure what else. This isn't something I'd use to mulch directly around my veggies, but it's a really nice mulch for walkways. Now in the back of the garden, my preference has been to use alfalfa hay to mulch, but I'm down to my last 2 bales right now. So I'm using up those, and then I'm probably going to use wood chips or leaf mulch for the rest. I also really like using this black fabric weed barrier, not as a permanent fixture, but to smother out weeds before I lay a natural mulch down. So in rows where I'm seeing a lot of weed growth, I'll lay this down for a few weeks before I mulch. Related to this, I'm trying to get a jump start on early season weeds. This time of year, I'm mainly seeing purple dead nettle and chickweed, both of which are actually very useful edible plants. But I don't necessarily want it aggressively spreading all over my beds and competing with tender young seedlings. I also don't necessarily want to just get rid of all of it. Dead nettle in particular is a great early season nectar source for some insects. But if there are huge mats in my beds, I will try to shallowly hoe them out and add them to my compost pile, or in the case of chickweed, feed it to my chickens, which they absolutely love. If a bed is particularly overrun, I may lay down plastic for a while to try to smother out some of the weeds before I do my spring planting. I'm also finishing up any general cleanup that I didn't do in the fall. My holy basil is particularly tenacious, and while most of my plants have pretty much decomposed by themselves by late winter and early spring, these tough little suckers show no signs of breaking down. So I just clip them off at soil level and pitch them into the compost. Once I've got my beds cleared out, I will typically come through and aerate by simply using my garden fork to open up the soil a bit. I do this because I have heavier clay soil and it does tend to get waterlogged and at times oxygen deprived, especially down below about 6 to 8 inches. So I find that doing this in the spring helps the soil breathe. It also helps disrupt the tunnels from burrowing critters like voles and moles that run through the garden. If I can avoid tillage or actually turning the soil over, it's better for the overall health of the soil microbiome. So in these established beds, this is all that I do to work the soil. Now, in most cases, I do not want to leave the soil bare. It's not the best for the soil ecology, and the weeds just tend to take over. So if I'm not planting my veggies right away, I'll either go in with a very early season cover crop. Here, I'm planting tiller radish. I also love a blend of oats, peas, and vetch for this purpose. Or I'll cover with leaf mulch. One thing to note, one reason that I may not cover my soil this time of year with something like leaf mulch is if we're having a very cool, wet spring. In that case, I may leave the soil exposed just to help it dry out a bit in preparation for planting. But typically, as soon as I've planted, the mulch is going back on. Now, this one could be considered as related to garden design, but something else that I'm tackling right now to prep my beds for spring is transplanting any perennials that just are not working for me in their current location. I'll show you an example of this. A couple of seasons ago, I planted a little Ben gooseberry, it's a dwarf variety of gooseberry, in this raised bed. And while it's doing great, frankly, it's a pain in the tuchus because it's incredibly thorny and is spreading everywhere. Now, it doesn't work well in this space, but because of its growth habit and thorns, I'm thinking it'll work well as a barrier plant more on the outside of the garden. And I want to get this transplanted now before it really breaks dormancy, and this will give it plenty of time to get re-established during the cool, rainy weather of early spring. So I'm going to dig all of these babies and move them to another bed. Then I'll have this space in the raised bed free for more of my early season vegetables. You can see here how much this spreads. I've got quite a few nice transplants, and here is the main shrub I originally planted. I'm going to move him up to one of the beds closer to the house. He won't be quite as pampered there, so we'll see how he gets on. Eventually, I'll probably do the same with these blackberries. Again, they're thriving, they're great plants, but I stuck them in this raised bed because when I brought them home, I didn't have any other place prepared to plant them. And this is just not the optimal spot for blackberries. They'd be much happier with a little more room to spread, and I'd be much happier not catching myself on the thorns every time I try to get back here in these beds and work. I'm not sure where I'm going with these yet, so I'm gonna hold off on transplanting these till I actually have an area prepped for them. So I probably won't get to these until late next winter, maybe early spring. And while I know I said this video is about prepping, not planting, with temperatures in the 50s and 60s for the next 10 days here in Ohio, I'm gonna do a little early season planting right now too. I actually probably could have started with my cold hardy greens back in the middle of February. It's been that warm here. I've got kale and collards along with the rest of my brassicas started indoors, but I may do another direct sowing of those. And I'll definitely be planting some endive, escarole, lettuce, spinach, arugula, mustard, and bunching onions. My cold hardy herbs like cilantro and dill can go in, and I may even do some early season peas. Now that may seem a little early to some, especially with that frost-free date looming a month and a half into the future. But all of these crops that I mentioned do much better in cooler temperatures and are tolerant of frost. And I want to show you a little trick here for timing as well. I've almost always got volunteers of all sorts popping up all over the garden. And right now I've got this great self-sowing of cilantro popping up here. Now what this tells me is that conditions are right for planting cilantro and other similar crops that are going to like the same type of weather. Now, of course, being Ohio, we always risk that the weather's going to dip back down into super frigid temps. So for that reason, I always have my frost cloths handy this time of year. But I take the risk on planting because for many of these crops, things especially like cilantro and spinach and many lettuces, the overall outcome is so much better when they're planted early versus waiting until later in the season to plant, when they often tend to just immediately bolt or get bitter and tough and do not taste that good. Well, I've got a lot of work to do, so I'm going to get back to it, but I'd love to hear from you. What are you doing right now to prep your garden for spring planting? Drop a line in the comments below and let me know. And if you enjoyed today's video, please consider subscribing to my channel, Growfully with Jenna. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.